Hello, my name is John Burton. I'm a professor at DePaul University in the History Department, and I'm going to talk to you today about Christopher Columbus, man and myth. For Americans, the name of Christopher Columbus is familiar to just about all of us. And all we have to do is sort of look across our country and we can see Christopher Columbus sort of appearing everywhere. In the name of our nation's capital, the District of Columbia, in state capitals like Columbus, Ohio, and to the west in major rivers like the Columbia River out in Oregon. Columbus certainly figures prominently in our neighbors to the south as well. We have the country of Colombia in South America, and we have British Columbia, one of the provinces in Canada. Columbus sort of really appears all over the place. We see him in New York. We have Columbus Circle. We have Columbus Avenues, Columbus Parks. In Latin America, many major cities have a Plaza Colón and statues. Columbus statues are in almost every major American city in both North and South America. The one on the left here is in Richmond, Virginia, the center one in Guadalajara, Mexico, and the one on the right in Nassau in the Bahamas. If you're interested in this, there's a guy who's actually cataloged Columbus statues and Columbus monuments across America, the Americas, and Spain and Italy. If you just Google Christopher Columbus and monuments, you'll come up with his entire list of hundreds of statues. My friends in Great Britain don't have quite as many Columbus connections, but I did find this one, the Hotel Columbus in London, but Columbus perhaps does not appear quite so prominently in the landscape of Great Britain. In school, we all learned this little ditty. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But often, we don't really know all that much more about Columbus. We may have some myths, but we know far less about the reality, and the reality of Columbus is what's really interesting. We do have a Columbus Day holiday in the United States that's really focused on shopping, on parades, and on vacations. But I think we can get to more than just this in terms of who Columbus is and what he really did for the world we live in today. So who is Christopher Columbus? Well, he perhaps was a transatlantic tour pioneer. His 4 voyages look an awful lot like a cruise calendar from one of the major cruise lines. But in fact, there's no doubt about it that Columbus didn't necessarily discover the New World, but the Columbian encounter that began on October 12th of 1492, without a doubt, changed the lives of people in the Old World and in the New in really profound ways. And the world was never the same after Columbus's voyages to the New World. Well, in our start of sort of trying to figure out who this man really is, one of the first things we want to know is, what did he look like? These are 2 of the earliest images that we have of Christopher Columbus. The one on the left is probably the earliest image of the discovery of the New World. It was painted in Seville's House of Trade. It's from a painting called The Virgin of the Navigator, and it has this little picture of Columbus down in the corner. It's from 1531. The image that you may be more familiar with is this image on the right that was made by Sebastiano del Piombo. It's a very common image that we have of Columbus. The attribution to Columbus may be a little bit later than its actual painting, and these 2 images look nothing alike. But the problem with these images is Columbus died in 1506, well before either of these paintings were actually painted. Neither are from life. So what do we really know about Columbus? We know that he had reddish or blonde hair, light-colored eyes. He was light-skinned. He said he could very easily be sunburned. I can sympathize with that. And he was about 6 feet tall or more, a very tall man for his time period. So, what else do we know about Columbus? Or perhaps I should say Cristoforo Colombo in Italian, or Cristobal Colon in Spanish, or Christopher Colombo in his native Genoese. Well, let's start in Genoa. He was certainly from Genoa. He was born probably a few months before October of 1451. There's a possibility his grandfather was Jewish, but we do know that his father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver. He was essentially a member of the middle class. He had 3 brothers at least one sister. And if you go to Genoa, you can see this house, which is supposed to be Columbus's house. One of the problems is most of the standing building is from the 18th century, about 2.5 centuries after Columbus would have died. But nevertheless, it still makes a great pilgrimage site for Columbus. So what do we know about his early life? Well, from what he told us, he says that he went to sea at about the age of 10. However, from other documentary records, we know at about that same age, he was working his father's cheese stand. So, what's the truth? How much seafaring time did Columbus actually have growing up? Well, his connections to the sea are not perhaps quite as strong as you might hope for someone who is going to be such an important discoverer. Probably his most important connection to the sea was through his brother Bartolomeo, who worked in a cartography workshop in Lisbon, and Portugal at this point was the major center for exploration and discovery in Europe. And map making in Lisbon was amongst some of the best. We do know that in 1470 he was on a Genoese ship in the service of René I of Anjou, who was going out and trying to conquer Naples, not successfully, but at any rate, he was on the ship. We're not necessarily certain that he was on the ship as a mariner. We do know that 3 years later, in 1473, he began an apprenticeship as a business agent to several Genovese families. And as a part of this apprenticeship, he would have learned accounting, bookkeeping, trading practices, and maybe some seamanship, but that would not have been the real focus of his training. His first major trip was to the island of Chios in the Aegean Sea off of Greece. At this point, the island was controlled by Genoa and was a major trading port, but we think he went there as a business representative of one of these Genovese families. So, Columbus also took a couple of trips to Northern Europe. In 1476, he accompanied cargo from Genoa to Bristol, England, and Galloway, Ireland. And he may have the next year traveled on a similar kind of voyage to Iceland. And on the way back from the first trip to Bristol and Galloway is when he actually met his brother again in Portugal and decided to establish himself in Portugal and left Genoa for good. So he arrives in Portugal about 1477, and we do know that he spends about 3 or 4 years working in the African trade. So he's on ships, trading ships that are leaving Portugal and going down the west coast of Africa, and they're buying slaves, they're buying gold, ivory, and returning to Portugal. And while he was there, he actually was established in one of the major Portuguese ports on the west coast of Africa, Elmina, which later becomes one of the most famous slave exporting ports in West Africa. So, Columbus's private life. We do know that he married Filipa Moniz Perestrello. She was the daughter of a Porto Santo governor and a Portuguese nobleman. We know that this is a sign that he probably was doing pretty well. He must have shown some real signs of talent, some success in business. I expect he had some charisma in order to have married somebody from such a prominent family. They had one son, Diego, and she may have died in 1485, although there's some possibilities that she lived well after 1485. But either way, whether she died or not, we know he left for Spain in 1485, leaving either his wife or his deceased wife behind. Well, Columbus was something of a scholar. He didn't necessarily produce good information, but he was a great consumer of information. He read widely. He read sort of some of the major accounts of exploration at the time, from the ancient and medieval world, Claudius Ptolemy, the Imago Mundi, Marco Polo's trip to China, Pliny the Elder. And based on these accounts, he had some sense of what the world was. This is an example of a map that was developed based on Ptolemy's worldview. Might have been a little bit helpful. This, however, was a map based on the Imago Mundi, which is heavily theological and religious in its account. It had Jerusalem in the center and things sort of scattered around it. Perhaps not quite so helpful in trying to figure out how to get to the New World. We know what he read because he was one of those people who wrote in the margins of his books. He was a major book defacer. And when he was reading books, he reacted to them. He wrote things in the margin. This is a copy of his Marco Polo, and he's written a whole series of comments in Latin in the margin. Well, one of the real myths of Columbus is that he was this great scientist, and the naysayers were these Dark Age people who believed the world is flat. Well, that's not true. That's not really an accurate account of what went on with Columbus. Columbus in this image is depicted as defending his views in front of the faculty at the University of Salamanca. Not what would be one of my favorite things to have to do. But you see that the faculty are sort of portrayed all here as priests and people of the Middle Ages. However, the faculty at Salamanca were actually really highly educated people, and they knew that what Columbus was proposing, a trip to go from Spain to Japan, was impossible. They knew how large the world was, they knew it was round, and they knew you could not get enough food on a ship to get all the way from Spain to Japan without a stop. So here's sort of some of the problems with Columbus's travel estimates. Actually, Columbus was a really bad geographer. The ancient Greeks knew how big the world was. They had sort of figured this out in the 3rd century BC. And although there's some confusion about exactly what their measurements said, Columbus was especially bad at this because he assumed an estimate for the circumference of the world that was significantly smaller than what the Greeks had originally found. Moreover, in the Middle Ages, geographers had actually worked out exactly what the measurement was for 1 degree of latitude at the equator. And he also misinterpreted what these medieval geographers had said and thought 1 degree of latitude was also smaller than what it really was. Moreover, based on Marco Polo's account, he decided that he thought Eurasia, Europe and Asia, the landmass, was much longer than it really was, putting Japan much further east than where we actually know it is today. So his conclusion was that Japan was only about 3,700 kilometers west of the Canaries. And actually it was more than 3 times that far away, 12,500 kilometers. So this is the world that Columbus ended up creating. This is actually based on a sketch map that was made by his brother Bartolomeo. On the right-hand side circle, you can see Africa, and up north of that, you can see sort of the peninsula of Spain coming off. And to the right, you can see China, and that big island is Japan. And you can see how he really should just be able to go a little bit west of the Canaries and be in Japan. Unfortunately, that didn't work very well for him. So what did Columbus know? Well, one of the things he did know about were the trade winds. The trade winds are crucial for getting back and forth across the Atlantic before the age of the steam engine. So in order to get back and forth across the ocean, you need, if you're heading west, to head south and get into the trade winds, and then when you're coming back you need to go north until you can get blown back eastwards again. He definitely knew about the westward trade winds, probably from his trips to Africa. Given the trouble he had getting back from his first voyage, he may not have been quite so clear about the easterlies coming back. So Columbus has this vision, he's come up with this idea. It's wrong, and he decides first to try to sell it to the King of Portugal, King John II. Portugal is the premier maritime power at this time. Even before Columbus, they've started to explore the west coast of Africa, and their long-term goal is to get to Asia and get trade goods and really circumvent the trade routes that went through Asia and the Mediterranean Sea. So he takes this, tries to sell it to King John twice, once in 1485 and again in 1488, and King John says, no, absolutely not. He's not interested. So he decides to travel instead to Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain, just to the east of Portugal. And he first makes his proposal in 1486, and it's rejected. They say no, but they don't reject it completely out of hand. Instead, Queen Isabella grants Columbus an annuity of 12,000 maravedis, about $86,000, to sort of keep him on hand, but right at the time she's not interested in funding this expedition. At the time, Spain is fighting the Reconquista, the ongoing centuries-long war between the Spanish kingdoms and the Muslim kingdoms in southern Spain. And until that is done, she doesn't have time for other activities. But in 1492, the last Muslim kingdom in southern Spain falls in Granada. And almost just months after this, Ferdinand and Isabella call on Columbus and they have him come to Cordoba, to Alcazar. This is their palace in Cordoba. And so you can imagine Columbus in this garden, walking through the garden, talking to the king and queen and trying to, basically once again sell to them on his voyage and his idea of getting to Asia. And they agree. Here's the terms of the deal. He gets really a great deal. He's granted the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He's going to be viceroy and governor of all the lands that he discovers. He gets to nominate all Spanish officers in these new territories and office holders. He gets a 10% of the revenues from land in perpetuity. That goes to his heirs as well. And he has the right to invest a 1/8 interest in all business ventures in the New World. It's a really sweet deal that Columbus has. So now he has to get to the New World. And it's not surprising this voyage occurs when it does. The centuries before Columbus are a time of incredible technological change. And there's really incredible improvements in early modern navigation. And some of the crucial items that have sort of appeared, some of them have been around for longer, but some important navigation tools are the cross staff. It looks like this. Helps you measure exactly where you are, how far away from the equator you are. Similarly, the astrolabe can do the same thing. And the quadrant does exactly the same thing as well. Columbus had an astrolabe and quadrant. He tried to take several readings on the ship. He was absolutely wrong and off for every single one of them. And he finally just sort of stops taking any more measurements. Now, it can be hard to take measurements with this equipment on a tossing, turning ship. Maybe he had bad equipment. But I have a feeling Columbus was just really bad at using the new modern technology that was available to him. In fact, Columbus is a kind of backward-looking guy, and he actually chooses a very old-fashioned way of getting to the New World. It's called dead reckoning. It requires very few tools, and it's something that navigators have been doing for centuries and centuries. You need a compass. On the right, upper right, is a Spanish compass from about the same time period, from the late 1400s. The compass gives your measurement for direction. You need an hourglass. That gives you your sense of time, how long you've been traveling. And the third thing you need is a long piece of rope with some kind of float or wood attached to the end of it. You throw it off the front of the ship, and then you time how long it takes for the ship to pass it. And that gives mariners a sense of speed. So with these three things, they can figure out their direction, their speed, and how long they've been traveling. All three pilots on each of his ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, all take measurements in exactly the same way. And they get similar results. And then Columbus does a little tricky thing. He has a 5/6 rule. Whenever he reports to his men exactly where they are in the ocean, he always only gives them a measurement of 5/6. So they never knew really how far west they were actually getting. Now, this system doesn't work badly, but it does have some limitations. It doesn't account for currents. It doesn't account for storms that blow you off course, and it doesn't account for errors. If you make an error the first day, that error is going to stay with you and you're not going to be able to correct it all the way across. So, we do know the first landing occurred on October 12, 1492 at the island of Guanahani. Where Guanahani is has been really a major point of speculation for a long time, for several centuries. All of these islands in the Bahamas at one time or another have laid claim to being Guanahani. Trying to figure out which one's the right island is a major historical exercise, and we basically have three sources. This is a great chance to sort of understand how historians answer difficult questions. We know his transatlantic route, from what direction he said he was going and at what speed. We know the route through the Bahamas because he says how he gets from island to island. And he does provide a description of the island. The problem is those three sources, if you put them all together, actually don't make any sense. You actually can't get from a place to a place to a place based on what he's describing. There's something not quite right in his descriptions and record keeping. And here's where the problem comes in. The evidence for all of this is his diary called the Diario. And he kept a journal while he was on the ship, but that original journal is now lost. When he got back in 1493, he made a copy. It's called the Barcelona copy, and he sent it to the King and Queen of Spain, to Ferdinand and Isabella. But that copy is also now lost. What we have is selections that were copied out of probably the Barcelona copy by a 16th century historian, Bartolomeo de las Casas, and included large chunks of Columbus's diary in his history. Luckily, plagiarism wasn't as major an issue back then, so he could get away with this. But because of this, the distance were removed from the original journal, it seems likely that measurements got misinterpreted, copied down wrong, so that what we actually see in Las Casas history is not an accurate representation of where Columbus actually went. There really are two major islands that these days are sort of considered prime candidates for his first landing site. If I were from the National Geographic, I would tell you there's no doubt he's landed in Samana Key. The National Geographic is a major proponent of the Samana Key site. Most historians sort of favor the what's used to be called Watlings Island or San Salvador in the Bahamas. And this gives you an idea of sort of how the two different routes might work. The best evidence for him landing on San Salvador or Watlings Island is Columbus's description. The island fits this description very well. Flat, no mountains, a coral reef all around the island, a large inner lagoon, lots of fresh water, and it was green and lush. This really fits San Salvador back then and today as well. Moreover, there's actually archaeological evidence from San Salvador, from a site on Long Bay. Columbus said that he gave to some of them red caps and to others glass beads, which they hung on their necks, and many other things of slight value. We swapped them for other things that we gave them, such as little glass beads and hawk's bells. So we know what Columbus traded with the native Lucayans when he arrived on San Salvador. And at the archaeological dig on Long Bay were found glass beads that were Spanish in origin, 2 Spanish metal buckles, pottery that was from Iberia, and a Bianca, a coin of Henry IV that would have been dated just a little bit before Columbus's trip. So I really think that Columbus landed on San Salvador, which is my preference. I do a lot of my research on San Salvador, so I like to think I'm truly walking in the steps of Columbus. So back to Columbus's trip. This is probably his probable first voyage through the Bahamas, and then from here he went to Hispaniola and then back to Spain. So on this first trip, he decides to establish the first Spanish settlement in the New World at La Navidad. It's in what's now Haiti, on the north coast of Haiti, on Hispaniola. And he builds it actually from the remains of the Santa Maria. The Santa Maria is grounded off the coast of Hispaniola. They take the Santa Maria apart. They use its parts in order to build this fort. And he leaves some of his men there, and the rest travel back to Spain. However, the fort doesn't do well. There's a great deal of tensions with Native Americans around the settlement. And when Columbus returns the next year, the fort is abandoned. So when he gets back, he finds La Navidad has been destroyed. There are about 12 or 13 corpses, Spanish corpses found in the village, and the rest of the villagers are gone. So on the second voyage, he once again travels through much of the Caribbean. He brings new settlers. He then decides to reestablish a new settlement at what he calls Isabella, further east along the coast on the north coast of Hispaniola. This is where things start to turn a little bit bad. As a part of this particular trip, he decides to kidnap 1,600 Taínos, native peoples of Hispaniola, to take back to Spain as slaves. And on this particular, it's clear that even before Columbus leaves, there's a great deal of tension between the Spanish settlers and the Native Americans on Hispaniola, and there's a lot of tensions within the Spanish community as well. Well, it takes Columbus a little while to get back. He doesn't get back again until 1498, and when he gets to Isabella, he finds just a few people still alive. It's clear that there's been tensions within the community as well as tensions with Native Americans. Many of the colonists have died from starvation and scurvy. It's clear that this particular Columbus trip has not been very successful. And this is really what starts to tarnish Columbus's reputation at home, is the failure of these two attempts at settlement in the New World and the really negative relationships that he's developing with Native Americans. When he arrives back in 1500, he's arrested, and there's this sort of image of Columbus in chains, which is a very popular image for 19th century artists. He's accused of tyranny during his governorship. He's accused of torturing both natives and Spanish settlers. There's some evidence that he tortured Spanish settlers as well when he couldn't get his way. He's stripped of all those offices that he had been promised in the original contract. And he only spent 6 weeks in prison. He actually is released after 6 weeks. He gets one more voyage to the New World in 1502. And on this voyage, his task is to try to figure out how he can get into the Indian Ocean. There's still a belief that Columbus has landed in the East Indies, and there should be a way to get through the strait to get into the Indian Ocean. And so he investigates a great deal of the Western Caribbean, but is unable, of course, to find a way of getting through what we know today as Central America. He spends a year on Jamaica. He's stranded for a year on Jamaica when he has problems with his ship, and he only gets saved because one of his men borrow a Native American canoe and actually paddle all the way from Jamaica, which is Santiago here on this map, all the way back to Hispaniola in order to get help. He has not had a very good reputation with the new Spanish governor in Hispaniola, who probably would have been just as happy if Columbus had just stayed stranded permanently. Well, Columbus gets back, and he's now lost most of the prizes that he'd been promised, his offices. He certainly has discovered and explored a lot of the Caribbean. And what you would hope is in his last years is he might tell a little bit about what it is he did. He did write 2 books. Unfortunately, neither of them is a memoir. The first is called The Book of Privileges, and basically it outlines all of his complaints to the Spanish crown about his treatment and the promises that had been broken to him as a part of his voyages of exploration. His second book is called The Book of Prophecies, and the Book of Prophecies sort of talks about his voyages, but talks about them really in the context of how he was fulfilling sort of the biblical prophecies, that the Bible had really foretold his travels to the New World, and he sort of explains how that was the case in the Book of Prophecies. This book in particular, I think, gives a sense of how Columbus in many ways is a backward-looking man, looking back towards the Middle Ages and not forward into the modern world that we live in today. We also know that he suffered from either gout or writer's disease. Gout, most of us know what it is. Writer's disease is actually a form of arthritis that you get through infection. It's possible he picked up writer's disease from impure water in the New World, although writer's disease often is a side effect as well of certain venereal diseases. So, Columbus is sort of a mystery even in death. He died in 1506, and he was initially buried in Spain. But in 1542, his body was moved to Santo Domingo in what's now the Dominican Republic, and he was buried there. He got to stay there for a couple centuries, but in 1795, his body was moved from Santo Domingo to Cuba. At the end of the Spanish-American War, his body was returned to Spain and was buried in this tomb in the cathedral in Sevilla or Seville. Or was it? Because at about the same time, a box with the name Chrisopher Columbus was found in Santo Domingo. And so that box with bones was buried in the cathedral in Santo Domingo in this tomb. So depending on what your travel plans are, you can either go to Santo Domingo or go to Seville in order to see Christopher Columbus's tomb. So back to Columbus. It's not true that Columbus doesn't think he discovered a new continent. He does. He actually does believe that he's discovered a new continent, and he names it Mundo Novo. You can see it at the very bottom of this map that that his brother drew. And he believes that this is sort of where we would think Australia is today, and that it's actually connected by a landmass to Asia. So Columbus does believe he discovered a new continent. He just thinks he discovered a different continent than the one he actually discovered. Well, thank you for your time. I hope you've learned a little bit about Columbus, and I have certainly enjoyed having a chance to talk to you.